The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for one of London's most famous traditions. Among the crowd stood Robert Thompson, a 63-year-old retired Army colonel, clutching his 8-year-old grandson Tommy's hand. Robert had served 28 years in the military and considered himself a guardian of British traditions. "Grandpa, when do the soldiers come out?" Tommy asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Any minute now, lad," Robert replied, straightening his own military tie. He wore it every time he visited the palace, a reminder of his years in service. "You're about to see something special. The Royal Guard has protected our Queen and King for centuries." The crowd began to murmur as the ceremony started. Red-coated guards in their tall black hats marched into position with perfect precision. Their boots clicked against the stone in perfect rhythm, creating a sound that echoed off the palace walls. Tourists raised their phones and cameras, capturing every moment of the pageantry. Robert watched with pride swelling in his chest. This was his Britain. This was the tradition he had served to protect. But then his expression changed. His smile faded as his eyes fixed on one particular guard standing at attention near the palace gates. The guard was a young black man, probably in his mid-20s, wearing the same red tunic and bearskin hat as his colleagues. He stood perfectly straight, his rifle held at exactly the right angle, his face expressionless as required by protocol. To most observers, he looked exactly like every other guard in the ceremony. But to Robert, something felt wrong. "This isn't right," Robert muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on Tommy's hand. Tommy looked up at his grandfather, confused by the sudden change in his tone. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Robert didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched as he stared at the black guard. Memories of what he considered the old days flooded his mind. Times when the Royal Guard looked different, when traditions were pure in his view. "It's just not the same anymore," Robert said, his voice growing louder. A few tourists nearby glanced in his direction. The ceremony continued around them. The guards performed their ancient ritual with clockwork precision, completely unaware of the storm brewing in one spectator's mind. The changing of positions happened exactly as it had thousands of times before, each movement practiced and perfect. But Robert couldn't focus on the ceremony anymore. His attention remained fixed on the one guard who, in his prejudiced view, didn't belong. "Look at that," Robert said, his voice carrying across the crowd. Several people turned to see what he was pointing at. "They've ruined our traditions. That uniform used to mean something." Tommy tugged at his grandfather's coat. "Grandpa, you're talking too loud." "I don't care who hears me," Robert snapped, his voice growing even louder. "This is supposed to be the Royal Guard. Our Royal Guard, not some diversity experiment." A middle-aged woman standing nearby looked shocked. She pulled her teenage daughter closer, clearly uncomfortable with Robert's words. Other tourists began to notice the commotion, some recording with their phones as they sensed drama unfolding. The black guard remained perfectly still, giving no sign that he could hear the insults being hurled in his direction. His training had prepared him for many things, including dealing with difficult crowds, but the personal nature of these attacks cut deep. Still, he maintained his composure, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded. "These people don't understand what that uniform represents," Robert continued, his face reddening with anger. "My grandfather fought in World War II. My father served in Korea. I gave 28 years of my life to this country, and now they're just handing out those uniforms to anyone who walks through the door." A young American tourist lowered his phone. "Excuse me, sir, but isn't he serving his country too?" Robert whirled around to face the tourist. "Serving his country? He's making a mockery of centuries of tradition. That uniform has history. It has meaning. It's not some costume for people to play dress-up in." The crowd around Robert was growing uncomfortable. Parents pulled their children closer. Some people moved away entirely, wanting no part of the scene that was developing. But others stayed, either too shocked to move or curious about how far this would escalate. Tommy looked up at his grandfather with confusion and embarrassment. At 8 years old, he didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew his grandfather was being mean to someone. "Grandpa, why are you being so loud?" "Because someone needs to speak up," Robert replied, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard now. Someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. This isn't what Britain is supposed to look like. A security guard stationed nearby began walking in Robert's direction, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist chatter. The ceremonial guards couldn't break their positions to address the disturbance, but palace security could intervene if necessary. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice," the security guard said politely but firmly. "I have every right to express my opinion," Robert shot back. "This is still a free country, isn't it? Or have they taken that away too?" The security guard remained calm and professional. "You're welcome to express your views, sir, but not in a way that disrupts the ceremony or disturbs other visitors." Robert looked around at the crowd of faces staring at him. Some looked disgusted, others appeared curious, and a few seemed to nod in agreement with his words. The attention only fueled his anger. Disturb other visitors? Robert laughed bitterly. What's disturbing is seeing our most sacred traditions being handed over to people who have no connection to our history. That young man standing there represents everything that's wrong with modern Britain. The blackguard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had heard every word, felt every insult, but his training held firm. Years of military discipline kept him rooted in place, maintaining the dignity of his position even as someone tried to strip it away with words. Several tourists were now openly recording the confrontation. A blogger who had been live streaming the ceremony found herself with much more dramatic content than she had expected. Her viewer count climbed rapidly as people shared the stream, drawn by the unfolding conflict. "You want to know what I see when I look at that uniform?" Robert continued, pointing directly at the guard. "I see the end of everything we used to stand for. I see politicians playing games with our heritage. That uniform should be earned through generations of British blood, not handed out like participation trophies." The security guard stepped closer. "Sir, this is your final warning. Either lower your voice and move along, or I'll have to ask you to leave the premises." But Robert was too far gone to back down now. The attention, the anger, and years of simmering resentment had combined into a perfect storm. "I won't be silenced about the destruction of my country's traditions. That man standing there is a shame to the crown, and everyone knows it." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The crowd fell silent, shocked by the direct and personal nature of the attack. Even those who might have harbored similar thoughts seemed taken aback by hearing them spoken so boldly and cruelly. The blackguard's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the tremendous effort required to remain motionless in the face of such personal hatred. Every instinct told him to respond, to defend himself, to set the record straight. But his duty came first, and his duty required silence and stillness. Tommy began to cry, overwhelmed by the tension and his grandfather's behavior. Other children in the crowd were also becoming upset, their parents hastily leading them away from the scene. What Robert didn't know, what he never bothered to learn, was that the young man he was attacking had earned that uniform through extraordinary service and sacrifice. The guard's name was David, and his story would soon emerge in ways that would make Robert's words not just cruel, but profoundly ignorant. But for now, in this moment, all anyone could see was an angry old man attacking a young soldier who couldn't defend himself, destroying the peaceful morning with his hatred and turning a moment of national pride into a scene of division and shame. Within 30 minutes of Robert's outburst at Buckingham Palace, the video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The American tourist who had challenged Robert's words had captured the entire confrontation on his phone. What started as a simple vacation video had turned into something much bigger. "This is unbelievable," muttered Lisa, a university student in Manchester, as she watched the video on her laptop. "I can't believe someone actually said this stuff out loud." She immediately shared it with her friends, adding her own comment about how disgusting the old man's behavior was. The video appeared first on Twitter, then quickly spread to Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Each platform added its own flavor of outrage. Young people made reaction videos, older veterans shared their thoughts, and news outlets began picking up the story. Robert Thompson had no idea what was happening in the digital world. He had returned home to his quiet house in Surrey, still grumbling to his wife Helen about what he'd witnessed at the palace. "They're destroying everything we fought for," he complained over lunch. That young man had no business wearing that uniform. Helen, tired of her husband's complaints, barely looked up from her soup. "Robert, you need to let this go. You've been going on about it for hours." But Robert couldn't let it go. He called his old army buddies, expecting them to agree with his views. Some did, quietly nodding along over the phone. Others, however, seemed uncomfortable with his harsh words. Meanwhile, the internet was doing what it does best, digging deeper into the story. Someone had recognized the guard from the video. A former soldier named Pete Williams had served alongside David in Afghanistan and couldn't believe what he was seeing. "That's David Johnson," Pete typed in a Facebook comment that would change everything. "He saved my life in Helmand Province. This old man has no idea who he's talking about." Pete's comment was screenshot and shared thousands of times. Soon, other soldiers who had served with David began coming forward with their own stories. The picture they painted was completely different from what Robert had assumed. Captain Andrew Miller, David's former commanding officer, was sitting in his office when a colleague showed him the viral video. His face went red with anger, but not at David, at the ignorant man who was attacking one of the finest soldiers he'd ever commanded. "This is outrageous," Captain Miller said. "David Johnson is a hero. He's earned every honor he's received." Within an hour, Miller had written a detailed Facebook post explaining David's service record, though he was careful not to reveal classified information. The post went viral immediately. Miller explained how David had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, how he'd repeatedly put himself in harm's way to protect civilians and fellow soldiers. He described the night David had single-handedly held off enemy fighters while calling in support for his trapped unit. "While some people sit in comfortable chairs criticizing others," Miller wrote, "men like David Johnson were bleeding for this country in the mountains of Afghanistan." Back in Surrey, Robert was completely unaware of the storm building around him. He spent the afternoon tending to his garden, still muttering about the morning's events. His phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. He'd never learned to use social media and had no idea his face was being shared across the internet. Helen, however, had started getting phone calls. Friends and neighbors had seen the video and recognized Robert. The calls weren't supportive. "Helen, is that really Robert in this video?" asked their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "I'm getting messages from my daughter about some awful man at Buckingham Palace." Helen's heart sank as she realized what had happened. She quickly found the video online and watched in horror as her husband made a fool of himself in front of thousands of strangers. "Robert," she called out to the garden, "you need to come inside, now." But the revelations about David were just beginning. Military historians started sharing information about David's family history. His father had indeed served in the Falklands War, earning commendations for bravery under fire. His grandfather had been part of the Royal Air Force during World War II, flying dangerous missions over occupied Europe. One historian posted a photo of David's grandfather in his RAF uniform, standing beside his fighter plane in 1943. 3 generations of service to the crown, the historian wrote. "This family has probably sacrificed more for Britain than most of us ever will." The story got even more interesting when details about David's recent heroism emerged. Military blogs began sharing the story of his final mission in Afghanistan, when he had volunteered to stay behind and cover his unit's retreat from an ambush. David had held his position for over an hour, fighting off enemy attacks while his wounded comrades were evacuated. He was the last man out, carrying an injured soldier on his back while under heavy fire. For this action, he had been awarded the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest honors for battlefield courage. "He could have left with the first group," wrote another soldier who was there that day. "No one would have blamed him, but David never left anyone behind. That's just who he is." The contrast between Robert's assumptions and David's reality was becoming stark. Social media users began creating side-by-side comparisons. Robert's angry, uninformed rants versus David's actual service record. Someone discovered that Robert himself had never seen combat during his 28 years in the Army. His service record, while respectable, was entirely administrative. He had worked in supply and logistics, Important jobs, but far from the battlefield heroics he seemed to think gave him authority to judge others. This man spent his career in offices while David Johnson was dodging bullets, one Twitter user pointed out. Yet he thinks he knows who deserves to wear the uniform. The story reached mainstream news by evening. BBC, Sky News, and other outlets began covering the viral confrontation and the surprising background story that emerged from it. Television news programs showed clips of the original video alongside photos of David receiving his military honors. David himself remained silent through all of this. As a serving member of the Royal Guard, he couldn't speak to the media or defend himself publicly. His friends and fellow soldiers were doing that for him, but David maintained the same professional dignity he had shown during Robert's attack. His commanding officer at the palace received dozens of calls from reporters wanting comments about the incident. The official response was measured and professional. "We're proud of all our guardsmen and their service to the crown. We don't comment on individual personnel matters." But privately, David's colleagues were furious about the attack on their friend and brother-in-arms. They knew his character, his dedication, and his sacrifice. Seeing him publicly humiliated by someone who knew nothing about him was deeply painful. The story took another turn when military charity organizations began sharing their experiences with David. He had volunteered countless hours helping wounded veterans adjust to civilian life. He visited hospitals, spoke at schools, and donated much of his salary to organizations supporting military families. "David Johnson represents everything good about military service," wrote the director of Help for Heroes. "He's not just a decorated soldier. He's a compassionate human being who continues serving even when he's off duty." By the end of the day, the hashtag #SimonJustice for David was trending across multiple platforms. Thousands of people were sharing stories about prejudice, military service, and the danger of making assumptions about others based on appearance. Robert finally learned about the internet storm when Helen showed him her phone that evening. His face went pale as he watched his own angry words being replayed over and over, followed by story after story about David's heroism. "My God," he whispered, sinking into his armchair. "What have I done?" The man he had called a shame to the crown was actually one of its greatest servants. The uniform he claimed was being given away carelessly had been earned through blood, sweat, and extraordinary courage. Everything Robert thought he knew was wrong, and now the whole world could see his ignorance on display. The revelation was complete, but the story was far from over. Robert Thompson woke up the next morning to find his entire world had changed overnight. His phone was buzzing constantly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. When Helen answered one of them, a reporter's voice came through the speaker. "We're trying to reach Robert Thompson about the incident at Buckingham Palace yesterday. Would he be available for comment?" Helen hung up immediately, but the calls kept coming. News vans were already parking outside their quiet suburban home. Neighbors peered through their curtains, whispering among themselves about the drama unfolding on their peaceful street. "Robert, you need to see this," Helen said, showing him the morning newspapers. His face was on the front page of 3 different papers. The headlines weren't kind. "Palace Racist Exposed," "Veteran Attacks Hero Guard," and "Bitter Man's Shameful Rant Goes Viral." But the newspapers weren't just covering his outburst. They had dug deeper into his background, and what they found wasn't flattering. Robert's military service record, which he had always spoken about with pride, was now being examined under a microscope. The Daily Mail had somehow obtained details about his career that Robert had never shared publicly. Yes, he had served for 28 years, but his record showed a different story than the one he told at dinner parties. Colonel Thompson's service was primarily in administrative roles, one article read. He spent most of his career managing supplies and paperwork, never seeing combat despite multiple opportunities for deployment. The article went on to describe how Robert had actually avoided overseas assignments, citing family concerns and other reasons to stay safely in Britain while his colleagues deployed to dangerous locations. Even worse, military records showed that Robert had received several disciplinary actions during his career. Nothing criminal, but incidents involving inappropriate comments about fellow soldiers and conflicts with superiors who tried to modernize the Army's approach to diversity and inclusion. "He was exactly the kind of old-school thinking we were trying to change," said one former colleague who spoke anonymously to reporters. Robert never liked it when the Army started opening up to people who didn't look like him. Meanwhile, more details about David's heroism were emerging daily. Military bloggers were sharing stories that painted a picture of a soldier who embodied everything the British Army claimed to represent. There was the story about David volunteering to carry supplies to an isolated outpost during a blizzard in Afghanistan. The regular supply convoy had been attacked, and the men at the outpost were running out of food and ammunition. David had taken a small team through dangerous mountain passes, dodging enemy patrols to deliver life-saving supplies. Another story described how David had spent his leave time helping to rebuild a school in an Afghan village that had been destroyed in fighting. Instead of relaxing or going home, he had organized other soldiers to help local families construct a new building where their children could learn. "He didn't do it for recognition," wrote one soldier who had worked alongside him. "David just saw people who needed help, and he helped them. That's who he is." The contrast between the two men was becoming painfully clear to everyone except Robert himself. While David was risking his life for others, Robert had been finding excuses to stay safe. While David was building bridges between cultures, Robert was building walls of prejudice. Robert's old Army friends were starting to distance themselves from him. Phone calls that used to be friendly chats became awkward conversations. Some of his former colleagues publicly condemned his behavior in interviews with reporters. "I served with Robert for several years," said retired Major James Crawford. "This kind of thinking has no place in today's military. The Army I know celebrates courage and character, not the color of someone's skin." The story took another embarrassing turn when journalists discovered Robert's social media activity. Though he claimed not to understand modern technology, he had been active in several online groups where he shared similar views to what he had expressed at the palace. Screenshots of his posts began circulating, showing years of complaints about political correctness and the decline of British values. He had shared articles questioning whether minorities could truly be loyal to Britain, and had made comments supporting the idea that certain positions should be reserved for traditional British people. "These posts show this wasn't a one-time outburst," said a social media expert interviewed by the BBC. "This represents a pattern of thinking that goes back years." Helen was mortified. She had known her husband held some old-fashioned views, but seeing them displayed publicly was deeply embarrassing. Her friends from the church were calling to express their disappointment. The women's group she belonged to was discussing whether she should step down from her leadership position. "I had no idea he felt this strongly," Helen told her sister over the phone. "I mean, I knew he sometimes said things that made me uncomfortable, but I never thought he would humiliate himself like this in public." The most damaging revelation came when a former Army psychiatrist came forward with information about Robert's psychological evaluations during his service. While respecting patient confidentiality, the doctor was able to confirm that Robert had shown signs of what would now be recognized as racial resentment and difficulty adapting to change. He was exactly the type of person who struggled when the military began integrating more fully, the psychiatrist explained to reporters. Some older soldiers found it threatening to their sense of identity and status. Back at Buckingham Palace, David continued his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown. His fellow guards rallied around him, offering support and solidarity. Officers who had served with him in Afghanistan were calling to check on his well-being. "David's handling this better than anyone could expect," said one of his closest friends in the Guard. "He's not bitter or angry. He just keeps doing his job with the same dignity he's always shown." The palace itself was quietly proud of how David was representing the Royal Guard during this difficult time. His behavior under pressure was exactly what they hoped for from their soldiers: grace under fire, literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, Robert's reputation was continuing to crumble. Local businesses were asking him not to come in, not wanting to be associated with the viral video. His grandson Tommy was being teased at school about his grandfather's behavior. The Other kids keep showing me the video on their phones, Tommy told his mother. They say Grandpa is a bad man. I don't understand why he was so mean to that soldier. Robert's daughter was horrified by the whole situation. She had always been proud of her father's military service, but now she was questioning everything she thought she knew about him. How could you embarrass our family like this, she asked during a tense phone call. And how could you attack someone who served our country with such honor? The psychological impact on Robert was severe. He had built his entire identity around being a proud British soldier who understood honor and duty. Now he was learning that a young man he had attacked embodied those values far better than he ever had. His sleep was disturbed by nightmares about the confrontation. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, wishing he could take back his words. But the internet doesn't forget, and his moment of hatred was now permanently recorded for the world to see. Local veterans organizations were also distancing themselves from Robert. The Royal British Legion, which he had been a member of for decades, was reviewing his membership. Other military charities he had supported were returning his donations. We cannot be associated with this kind of behavior, said the chairman of his local veterans group. Our organization stands for honor, respect, and service to all who wear the uniform, regardless of their background. The most painful part for Robert was realizing that his prejudice had blinded him to the very qualities he claimed to admire. David represented everything Robert said he wanted to see in a soldier: courage, dedication, sacrifice, and loyalty to the crown. But Robert had been so focused on what David looked like that he couldn't see who David really was. And now the whole world could see Robert's failure of character displayed for everyone to judge. The reckoning was far from over. A week had passed since the incident, and Robert Thompson was a broken man. He hadn't left his house except to buy groceries at odd hours when fewer people would recognize him. The media attention was finally dying down, but the damage to his reputation and self-respect was permanent. He sat in his living room, surrounded by boxes of military memorabilia that now felt meaningless. His medals, certificates, and photographs seemed to mock him. What good were they if he had failed so completely to understand what real honor looked like? Helen had stopped speaking to him beyond basic necessities. His daughter wasn't returning his calls. Even his grandson Tommy seemed afraid of him now, hiding behind his mother whenever Robert tried to approach. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Robert ignored it, assuming it was another reporter or curious neighbor. But the ringing continued, patient but insistent. "I'm not talking to any more journalists," Robert called out without getting up from his chair. "Sir, I'm not a journalist," came a calm voice through the door. "My name is David. I believe we met at Buckingham Palace last week." Robert's blood ran cold. The young guard he had humiliated was standing on his doorstep. Robert's first instinct was to pretend he wasn't home, but something in the man's respectful tone made him hesitate. "What do you want?" Robert called out, his voice shaking slightly. "I'd like to talk with you, sir, just for a few minutes, as one serviceman to another." Robert sat frozen for several long moments. Part of him wanted to hide upstairs until the man went away. But another part, a deeper part that remembered what it meant to face difficult situations with courage, forced him to stand up. With trembling hands, Robert unlocked the door and opened it slowly. David stood there in civilian clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, and a peaceful expression that showed no hint of anger or revenge. "Thank you for opening the door, sir," David said politely. "I know this must be uncomfortable for you." Robert couldn't meet his eyes. "Why are you here? Haven't you done enough damage to my reputation?" David's eyebrows raised slightly. "Sir, I haven't said a word to any reporters. I've been doing my job and staying quiet, just like I always do." This was true, and Robert knew it. All the damaging information about his past had come from other sources: journalists, former colleagues, and military records. David himself had maintained complete silence throughout the entire ordeal. "What do you want from me?" Robert asked, still standing in the doorway. "I'd like to come in and talk, if that's okay." "I brought some tea," David said, holding up a small bag from a local shop. "I thought we might have a conversation, man to man." Against every instinct screaming in his head, Robert stepped aside and let David enter his home. It felt surreal, like inviting the person whose life you'd tried to destroy into your living room for a chat. David looked around at the cluttered space filled with military memorabilia. Photographs of Robert in uniform, certificates of service, and various medals covered every surface. He studied them with genuine interest, not mockery. "You served for a long time," David observed, examining a photo of young Robert in dress uniform. 28 years is impressive, that takes dedication." Robert was completely thrown off balance. He had expected anger, confrontation, maybe even threats. Instead, David was complimenting his service record. "Why are you being nice to me?" Robert asked suspiciously. "I said terrible things about you. I tried to humiliate you in front of hundreds of people." David turned to face him directly for the first time. His eyes were calm but serious. "Because you're a fellow veteran, sir, and because I think there are some things you need to understand." They sat down awkwardly, David on the couch and Robert in his usual armchair. David pulled out the tea he'd brought and began preparing it as if he were a welcome guest rather than the target of Robert's hatred. "I've been thinking about what you said at the palace," David began, his voice steady and thoughtful. "About tradition and what the uniform means. I think we actually agree about some things." Robert stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that uniform does have deep meaning. It represents centuries of service and sacrifice. Men have died wearing those colors, fighting for values they believed in." David poured hot water into the cups he'd brought. "I feel the weight of that history every time I put it on." "Then why?" Robert started to ask, then stopped himself. "Why am I wearing it?" David finished gently. "Because I earned it, sir. Just like you earned your uniform during your 28 years of service." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "I brought some things I wanted to show you. Not to boast, but to help you understand who I am." He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph of himself in combat gear, standing with his unit in Afghanistan. The men looked tired, dusty, and serious, the look of soldiers who had seen real action. "This was taken after we held Hill 472 for 3 days against constant attack," David explained. "We were running low on ammunition and water, but we held the position because it protected a village below us." Robert found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. David showed him another photo, this one of him carrying a wounded Afghan child to a medical station. This little girl stepped on a landmine while playing near her house. "We were the closest unit, so we responded to the emergency call." "Did she make it?" Robert asked quietly. "She lost her leg, but she survived. Her family sent me this letter 6 months later." David pulled out a piece of paper covered in careful English writing. "They said she wants to be a doctor now, to help other children who get hurt." Robert's hands were shaking as he took the letter and read it. The gratitude expressed by the child's father was overwhelming. They thanked David not just for saving their daughter, but for treating their family with kindness and respect during the worst moment of their lives. "There are more letters," David said, pulling out a small stack. "From the families of the 6 men I helped evacuate during the ambush, from villagers whose water system we repaired, from children at a school we helped rebuild." Robert read letter after letter, each one describing acts of courage, kindness, and sacrifice. These weren't official military reports or newspaper articles. These were personal thanks from real people whose lives had been touched by David's service. "Why are you showing me this?" Robert whispered, his voice breaking. "Because I want you to understand that I don't wear that uniform lightly," David replied. "Every day I put it on, I think about these people. I think about the responsibility I carry. I think about the men who wore it before me and the standard they set." David pulled out one more item, a faded photograph of a young black man in Royal Air Force uniform standing next to a fighter plane. "This is my grandfather," David said proudly, "Flight Sergeant William Johnson. He flew 37 missions over occupied Europe during World War II. Shot down twice, captured once, escaped, and made it back to his unit." Robert stared at the photo, his worldview crumbling completely. "Your grandfather," Fought the Nazis, yes, sir. Risked his life for the same values you and I both swore to defend. My father carried on that tradition in the Falklands. I've tried to carry it on in Afghanistan." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Robert's old mantel clock. Trunky. Generations of service to the crown, 3 generations of sacrifice for Britain, and Robert had dismissed it all because of the color of their skin. "I don't understand," Robert said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "If your family has served so honorably, why didn't I know? Why didn't anyone tell me?" David's expression was patient, but firm. "With respect, sir, you didn't ask. You saw my face and decided you knew everything about me. You made up your mind without knowing anything about my background, my service, or my character." The truth hit Robert like a physical blow. He had been so blinded by prejudice that he had attacked the very kind of soldier he claimed to respect. David represented everything Robert said he valued: courage, sacrifice, loyalty, and honor. But Robert had been unable to see it. "God," Robert whispered, "what have I done? What kind of man have I become?" David leaned forward, his expression softening. "You're a man who made a mistake, sir. A big mistake. But still just a mistake. The question now is what you're going to do about it." For the first time in a week, Robert felt something other than shame and self-pity. He felt the possibility of redemption, though he had no idea how to achieve it. The conversation was far from over, but the foundation for understanding had been laid. 2 veterans from different generations and different backgrounds were finally beginning to see each other as human beings, rather than symbols of everything they feared or misunderstood. The real work of healing was just beginning. The conversation with David had changed Robert in ways he couldn't fully understand. For 3 days after the young soldier's visit, Robert sat in his living room staring at the letters and photographs David had shared with him. Each story of courage and sacrifice felt like a mirror reflecting his own failures back at him. Helen noticed the change immediately. Robert had stopped his angry muttering about the news. He wasn't complaining about political correctness or the decline of Britain. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, wrestling with something deep inside himself. "What's wrong with you?" Helen asked on Thursday morning. "You've barely said a word since Tuesday." Robert looked up from the letter he was reading for the 10th time, the one from the Afghan father thanking David for saving his daughter's life. "I think I've been wrong about everything, Helen. Wrong for years." Helen studied her husband's face. The angry lines that had become permanent features seemed softer somehow. The bitter expression he'd worn for months was replaced by something that looked almost like regret. "What do you mean, wrong about everything?" Robert stood up slowly, his joints aching from sitting in the same position for hours. "That young man came here Tuesday, the guard from the palace. David." Helen's eyes widened. "He came here. What did he want?" "To talk. To help me understand." Robert's voice was quiet, almost wondering. "Helen, his grandfather flew combat missions against the Nazis. His father served in the Falklands. And David himself, the things he's done in Afghanistan, he's a real hero. But you said," "I said a lot of things, terrible things, about a man who served our country better than I ever did." Robert walked to the window and looked out at the street where reporters had camped just days before. "I've been a fool, Helen. A prejudiced, ignorant fool." That evening, Robert made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his daughter Patricia for the first time since the incident. "Dad?" Patricia's voice was cold when she answered. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Patricia, I need to talk to you. About what happened. About who I've become." There was a long pause. "Are you calling to defend yourself? Because I don't want to hear it." "No," Robert said firmly. "I'm calling to apologize. To you, to Tommy, to everyone I've embarrassed and hurt." Patricia's voice softened slightly. "Dad, what's brought this on?" Robert spent an hour telling his daughter about David's visit, about the letters from grateful families, about the 3 generations of military service he had dismissed because of his prejudice. Patricia listened in stunned silence as her father acknowledged mistakes she never thought he'd admit to making. "I want to make this right," Robert concluded. "I don't know how, but I have to try." "What are you thinking of doing?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking of going back to the palace, to apologize publicly the same way I attacked him publicly." Patricia was shocked. "Dad, that's really brave. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm not sure I'm ready for anything anymore," Robert admitted, "but I know I can't live with myself if I don't try to make amends." The next morning, Robert did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not in church, not formally, but quietly in his garden, asking for the strength to do what was right instead of what was easy. Then he got dressed in his best suit, the one he wore to military ceremonies, and took the train to London. The journey gave him plenty of time to think about what he was going to do. Part of him hoped David wouldn't be on duty. Part of him hoped the whole thing would be quiet and unnoticed. But mostly, he hoped he would have the courage to follow through. When Robert arrived at Buckingham Palace, he was relieved to see that David was indeed standing guard at his usual position. The same spot where Robert had hurled his insults at EO. Week and a half earlier, Robert approached slowly, his heart pounding. In his hands, he carried a piece of cardboard he had worked on for hours the night before. The message was simple but heartfelt. "I was wrong. Guardsman David is a hero who earned his place. I apologize for my ignorance and prejudice." Several tourists noticed the elderly man with the sign and began taking pictures. Some recognized him from the viral video and started recording. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, curious about what was happening. Robert stood in the exact spot where he had made his shameful outburst. His hands shook as he held up the sign, but his voice was clear when he began to speak. "My name is Robert Thompson," he announced to the growing crowd. "Last week I stood in this spot and said terrible things about one of your guards. I attacked a young man based on nothing but the color of his skin." The crowd murmured with recognition. Phones came out as people realized they were witnessing the sequel to a story that had captivated the internet. "I was wrong," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "Completely, shamefully wrong. Guardsman David has served this country with honor and courage that I never showed in my own military career. His family has protected Britain for 3 generations while I sat in comfortable offices, judging people I knew nothing about. David, standing at attention in his ceremonial position, could hear every word but couldn't react. His training required him to remain motionless, but those watching closely could see the slight relaxation in his shoulders, the subtle softening around his eyes. "I've spent years being angry about changes I didn't understand," Robert went on. "I blamed others for my own failures and disappointments. I let prejudice poison my heart until I couldn't see the very qualities I claimed to admire, even when they were standing right in front of me." An elderly woman in the crowd began to cry. Several young people were live-streaming the apology, and the viewer counts were climbing rapidly. "Guardsman David, if you can hear me, I'm sorry. Sorry for my words, sorry for my hatred, and sorry it took me so long to see the truth. You represent everything good about military service, and I was too blind to recognize it." Robert's voice broke slightly. "To everyone who was offended by my behavior, I apologize. To my family, who have been ashamed of me, I'm sorry. To anyone who thinks my apology isn't enough, you're probably right. But it's all I have to offer." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the usual chatter of tourists had stopped as people absorbed the weight of what they were witnessing. Robert stood there for several more minutes, holding his sign and letting people take pictures. He answered questions from reporters who quickly arrived on the scene, repeating his apology and acknowledging his mistakes without making excuses. "What changed your mind?" asked one journalist. "Meeting the man I had wronged," Robert replied simply. "Learning who he really is instead of who I assumed he was. Discovering that everything I thought I knew was based on ignorance and prejudice." When David's shift ended an hour later, he walked past Robert with the same professional bearing he always maintained. But as he passed, he gave the slightest nod, an acknowledgement between two veterans that spoke louder than words. The video of Robert's apology went viral just as quickly as his original outburst had. But this time, the response was different. Many people praised his courage in admitting his mistakes publicly. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether his change of heart was genuine or just damage control. Robert didn't care about the public reaction. He had done what he needed to do for his own conscience and for the young man he had wronged. That evening, his grandson Tommy called him for the first time since the incident. "Grandpa? Mom showed me the video of you saying sorry. Does this mean you're not angry anymore?" Robert's eyes filled with tears. "No, Tommy, I'm not angry anymore. I was wrong to be angry, and I'm sorry you had to see your grandfather behave so badly." "It's okay, Grandpa. I'm proud of you for saying sorry. That's what brave people do when they make mistakes." Out of the mouths of babes, Robert thought. His 8-year-old grandson understood something it had taken him 73 years to learn. The story didn't end with the apology. Robert spent the following months trying to understand how he had let prejudice take root in his heart. He read books about other cultures, volunteered with veterans organizations that helped soldiers of all backgrounds, and slowly began rebuilding relationships with family members he had alienated. David continued his service with the same quiet dignity he had always shown. He never gave interviews about the incident, never sought recognition for his grace under pressure. He simply did his job, protected the palace, and served his country with honor. The incident became a powerful reminder that prejudice blinds us to the heroism that exists in unexpected places, and that it's never too late to choose honor over hatred. It showed that real courage sometimes means admitting you were wrong, and that true strength comes from the willingness to change and grow. Most importantly, it proved that even in our divided world, human connection and understanding can still triumph over ignorance and hate, if we're brave enough to let them.